All right, everyone, welcome to part 2 of chapter 7. So, as I said earlier in part 1, the appeal of the behavioral way of thinking is that it really can easily explain a lot of things about our behaviors. And so, for example, your book talks about that classical conditioning can help us understand how we acquire fear. It can also help us understand how we develop food aversions. So I think in the class activity, or in one of the videos I did relevant to this chapter, I shared that when I was younger, developed a food aversion to Tootsie Rolls because I, ate a large quantity of them and got sick. And so I associate the Tootsie Rolls with the sickness, even though it really wasn't the Tootsie Rolls. It was a decision I made relevant to the Tootsie Rolls. And so learning principles really can help us understand things like food aversions. So if you do have a food aversion, maybe sit down and kind of think through how that developed, because I would bet you money that it has something to do with classical conditioning or operant conditioning. But I want to focus more on the issue of fear, because I can tell you, as a clinical psychologist, classical conditioning absolutely helps us understand the development of some anxiety-related disorders. So, for example, when I worked in the VA with veterans, many of them, through multiple learning opportunities and learning experiences, had come to associate loud noises with dangerous situations. The noise itself is in no way a real threat, but the noise always kind of indicated or was associated with something bad and scary. And so there's a ton of research really supporting classical conditioning as an explanation for the development of psychological disorders such as PTSD and again, other forms of anxiety. And so what's really cool is this is an area of what we would call basic research, meaning just kind of research helping us learn about something, compared to applied research, which is the research conducted to try to inform everyday life. And so I think that this is a really cool example of how basic research can inform applied research. And so through the principles of classical conditioning, we learned about counter conditioning, which is where a conditioned stimulus is paired with some other stimulus that elicits a response that's incompatible with the unwanted response. So you can think about that as you're essentially pairing something else to try to prevent the response of fear. And we do that in clinical psychology. That's a lot of what therapists do with trauma survivors. And so it absolutely has informed psychotherapy. And so the specific form of psychotherapy your book refers to is systematic desensitization. It's essentially creating an incompatible response. And in this situation, it would be helping the person feel more relaxed in situations that previously would have been feared or would have elicited anxiety. So lots of really cool real world applications, especially things that I think are interesting as a clinical psychologist. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about operant conditioning, which is the second type of learning talked about in your textbook. And so with operant conditioning, we're essentially talking about whether the animal's response will become more or less likely. And so for your one of your class activities this week, you're going to be asked to identify whether a scenario describes reinforcement or punishment. So the first step to trying to determine what form of consequence it is you have to try to determine, is the behavior more or less likely to occur in the future? If the behavior is more likely to occur in the future, then you're looking at reinforcement. If you find that the behavior is less likely to occur in the future, then that is a form of punishment. So if this cute little dog stands up on his hind legs and you give him a T-bone, it looks like that's quite a reinforcer, right? Because what we see is that dog is going to be more likely to stand up on his hind legs in the future. Whereas if the dog stands up and you say no and kind of shake your finger, then that's a punishment because the animal's less likely to do it in the future. So essentially, when you're trying to determine whether something is a reinforcer or is a form of punishment, you need to try to determine, is the behavior more or less likely to occur in the future. So we also, I have a few other things I want to say about this, sorry. So we also need to think about whether it is a positive or negative form of reinforcement and punishment. Now, these are terms that students often get really confused about. Positive doesn't mean good. Okay, negative doesn't mean bad. Positive and negative basically mean the presence or absence of something. Okay, so a positive reinforcer, so the reinforcement part means that the animal's more likely to do it. The positive part means you are giving something. Okay, it's the addition of a pleasant thing. Whereas negative in this situation means the removal of something. So you're removing, subtracting an unpleasant consequence. So let's do some examples. So for positive reinforcement, you're trying to increase the likelihood the behavior happens again in the future, and you're doing so by giving a pleasant consequence. So let's say for everything you got right on the quiz, I gave you $1. Okay, I'm giving you something good, something you like. You're more likely to then try harder on the exams in the future. If it's a negative reinforcer means I want the behavior to occur more often in the future. Negative means I'm going to do it by removing something. So if it's a negative reinforcer, I'm removing an unpleasant consequence. So let's say if you were to get 100 on your next quiz, you then don't have to take the following quiz. So I'm removing the negative thing, which is having to take a quiz, because I'm trying to reinforce or increase the likelihood that you do the behavior I want. So there are also positive and negative punishments. Those are a little bit harder to distinguish, so I'm not going to really focus in on those too much. But just to give you some examples, a positive punishment could be spanking. Okay, so you are giving the animal an unpleasant consequence to then decrease the likelihood that something will happen in the future. Whereas a negative reinforcement, a negative punishment could be something like a teenager losing privileges of using the car. So you're removing something pleasant because you're trying to reduce the likelihood they do the behavior again. Okay. Again, positive, negative punishment, I think it's a little bit trickier. I'm not going to really get too specific about that, but I do expect you to be able to identify whether something is a reinforcer or punishment, and then also be able to distinguish negative reinforcement from positive reinforcement. Okay. Your book also talks about distinguishing primary and secondary reinforcers and a few other important kind of details related to operant conditioning. So, please make sure you take a look at those. But I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit more about patterns of delivery in terms of reinforcers. And so I think when we talk about reinforcement and punishment, most people picture continuous delivery, meaning that for example, reinforcer occurs every time the behavior occurs. So every time the kid does what you want, you give him a piece of candy, or every time the dog sits, you give him a treat. So that's continuous, and that's the most effective for initial learning. If you've ever trained an animal, you know you need to give the treat every single time. Same thing with punishment. When you're initially teaching the animal, you have to do it every time. So I'm trying to teach my cat to not scratch our new couch, and so I use a squirt bottle and spray her every time she scratches it. So that's continuous. But we can also use intermittent reinforcement or intermittent punishment, which is where the consequence will occur either every certain number of times or maybe a certain amount of time. So for example, with the cat, let's say I squirt her every 5th time she scratches the couch. Or if you're trying to, train an animal to sit, then maybe for every 5 minutes it's sitting, you give it a treat, not every single second it's sitting. So intermittent, that's a hard word apparently. Intermittent is actually very resistant to extinction because the animal doesn't know whether or not the reinforcer is coming. So you can think about gambling. If you've ever played the slot machines, you don't get a reward every time you pull that handle, right? It's an intermittent schedule, meaning that you get the reinforcer every certain number of times and it's random. And so you always think, well, maybe the next time, and you keep putting your quarters in and pulling that handle. And that intermittent reinforcement schedule is so effective in maintaining behavior because we don't know when the reinforcer is coming. Shaping, on the other hand, is where we use reinforcer to successive approximations to try to get the animal to do a desired response. So think about if you want to teach rats to play basketball. Okay, if you take the approach of, well, as soon as the rat dunks the ball, he gets a treat, you will be waiting forever for that rat to dunk the ball. So instead, with most complex behaviors with animals, we actually will just reinforce as they get closer and closer to doing what we want. So probably the first step would be to reinforce the rat if it just touches a basketball, right? The next step would probably be if it, holds the basketball and takes one step towards the basket, you reinforce that. And so you are literally shaping the behavior to try to get it to be what you want by reinforcing closer and closer approximations to the desired behavior. And so that's how most complex behaviors in animals get trained. So thinking about, Shamu at SeaWorld doing amazing tricks, that whale didn't just do all those things in the first try and they reinforced it. They're going to get it closer and closer to doing the things they want it to do, and then will reinforce that behavior, thus shaping it closer and closer. So there are, similar to classical conditioning, a ton of applications for operant conditioning. Again, really important ones for the clinical psychology field. The main one being behavior modification, which is also called ABA, or applied behavioral analysis. So this is the leading psychotherapy used for children with autism. And so it's where you use the techniques of operant conditioning to try to teach new responses or to eliminate maladaptive or problematic behaviors. It all relies on reinforcement. So as a child with autism engages in the behaviors you want them to engage in, then you're going to reinforce them. If they engage in problematic behaviors, then you ignore them. And so, for example, if you want I had treated a child with autism that engaged in a lot of self-injury and wasn't able to really sit still and do any schoolwork. And so what we would do is use applied behavioral analysis that whenever the kid would sit and actually do some of his homework, he got rewarded. But the minute he started engaging in self-harm, then the reward was removed. And so we can use food. Obviously, with children, that's not ideal. You don't want to give them an M&M every time they do something right, because that has long-term consequences. So instead, for ABA, often with kids, every time they do a desired behavior, they get to play with a toy for 5 minutes, for example. So you could set up a schedule where for every 10 minutes the child did homework, he gets to play with his toy for 5 minutes. Whereas if, he was off task or engaging in self-harm, then, he didn't get his reward. So it was just kind of ignored. So there's this big debate, about whether punishment works. Is it harmful? And so the field of psychology is pretty confident in that punishment works best if it immediately follows the behavior, is relatively mild, and is consistent. If you punish an animal long after they do the behavior, they will not associate the punishment with what they did. So for example, if you come home and your new puppy has peed on the floor and you whack his nose with a newspaper, that is not going to be effective because the dog probably peed long ago and has no idea why he was just punished. Harsh punishment actually leads to a lot of mental health issues, which can detract from the purpose of the punishment, which is to teach the animal or the child, for example. Consistency is the biggest mistake with punishment with children. When I've done clinical practice in the past and had a child that engaged in problematic behaviors, most of the time what I discovered was the parents, caregivers, whoever, were not consistently punishing. And so the child just didn't know what to expect. And so what we find is that reinforcement of good behavior is actually more effective than punishment. So ignoring bad behavior, rewarding good behavior. If you're going to punish, again, immediate, mild, consistent. What we find, most parents will accidentally reward bad behavior. So picture the kid that's having a temper tantrum in Walmart because they want a toy. They throw themselves on the ground and the parents, mortified, embarrassed. And after a 10-minute temper tantrum, the parent says, "Fine, here's your toy." The kid got what he wanted, right? And so that's actually reinforcing the poor behavior. So operant conditioning has a ton of really cool implications, particularly for the field of clinical psychology. So I'm going to run out of time in this video. So go on to part 3, and I'm going to show you some videos highlighting some of the principles of operant conditioning.